All right, now we're going to be looking at the digestive system, and then a little bit later on, we'll also be looking at the respiratory system, and these are the two things that will be on your next lab exam. This is also the components of the digestive system from the mouth all the way to the anus. We call that the alimentary canal, and we need to learn all of the components of those and what functions they have and where things are broken down. And so this is, of course, where we break down, but also where we absorb and assimilate nutrients. We are extracting nutrients that we need from food and putting them to use in our body, transforming nutrients, so to speak, into a useful form. Like when we eat an Oreo, well, we have to transform that to glucose. We absorb nutrients and distribute them where they're needed as well. All right, so here are the different components at the beginning section here that we're going to look at: the mouth, the pharynx, and esophagus. It was once said that health comes first, and our health should come first, and it enters through the mouth. You are what you eat. And so the content then determines the function. So our houses, the mouth houses structures that we need for speech, which is a function, and for mastication. Well, mastication is chewing of food. And so the functions here, we have ingestion, the cheeks, the lips, and the tongue, and they help to mobilize food. We also have a very small component or beginnings of the components for digestion. We have mechanical. This is a large mechanical component for digesting, where we're chewing the food and we actually are forming what we call a bolus of food between the chewing and our saliva. That is mastication. And we also do some chemical digestion here, just the very beginnings. We have 3 salivary glands that is going to primarily digest starches and maybe begin a little bit for fat, but primarily it's going to be salivary amylase. So the beginning of the breakdown of starch actually occurs in the mouth. Next here we have the bony palate. I also forgot to say, you don't want to use the term mouth. You want to use the term buccal cavity or oral cavity. Some say buccal cavity, okay? Always be sure on your lab exams that you use the scientific term, and I made that mistake in the last slide. I didn't say oral cavity or buccal cavity. I wasn't really looking at the slide to remind myself. So be sure and do that. So now on to the hard palate. All right, and so we have a hard palate and a soft palate. The hard palate is a bony plate, and you can kind of see that kind of well here, right here. It's actually the bony plate that makes the subsection of what we call the palate, or the roof of our mouth. And this forms the anterior or the front 2/3 of the roof of the oral cavity. Looks like the last slide got me doing a very weird thing with my mouth again. I'm going to have to learn to really pause and wait. All right, so the organs of the digestive system. We're looking now at the soft palate. And so hard palate, obviously that's going to be the bony structure. Now the soft palate isn't going to be a bony tissue. This is a fold of soft tissue, and it is attached to the back of the hard palate. It doesn't have a bony framework like the hard palate does, and this helps aid swallowing and breathing. Here we have the tongue, and the tongue is going to perceive gustatory stimuli, gustation, tasting. This is the action of tasting. It also aids in mastication. It helps you to chew your food and move it around your mouth, and then again, so we can form what we call a bolus of food, because the bolus of food is what's going to actually go back down through our esophagus. And then, so with that, it also aids in what we call deglution, and this is swallowing. Next here we have the teeth. I don't focus too much on learning the names of the teeth. They are on your list, just basically the 5 types. Incisors, canines, molars, premolars. And so the teeth, though, are considered organs of the digestive system. We probably spoke about in lecture how a lot of people can consider them to be bone and part of the skeletal system, but they are not considered bone. Of course, what do? They aid in the mechanical breakdown of food. Next here we have the lingual frenulum. This is very hard to see in the models, and I'm thinking in this particular model there's nothing on it for the key, so it's hard to determine, but it looks like maybe that little white dot is supposed to represent the lingual frenulum, although it may just be under the tongue and the tongue is not movable. But this is a great picture of it. Did you know that it had that fancy name? Lingua, or lingual, that always refers to speech, linguistics, right? It comes from the same Latin root. And so it's a frenulum is the technical term. This actually is more important than you would think, mostly when things go wrong, because if it is too short, people are what we can call, in common terms, tongue-tied. This can be a problem for infants with breastfeeding because it makes it difficult for them to latch on properly. My niece actually had this problem, and they actually can go in and they can clip it, and so that they can move the tongue a little more freely as they need to. Well, we've learned about what papillae is before in Anatomy 1, and these are lingual papillae. As you can see here, we have several different types. I just want you to know them in general. You don't have to know all the names of the different types, but you can see you have vellate, fungiform, filiform, foliate, but all of these raised projections that sometimes differentiate into taste cells. They're a cluster of cells. These are small projections on the tongue. These are going to be the lingual papillae. All right. Now we have the pharynx, and we're going to break that down into 3 parts. This is what we normally call our throat. This is what we normally call the throat. Okay, you can see that in this general area here. B is the actual letter on this particular model to point to, but it's more than just one area, because we're going to break it down into oropharynx and all. So this forms a continuous muscular passage for food, air, and liquids to pass down from your nose and your mouth to either your lungs or your stomach. And hopefully it goes to the right place, because we've all experienced swallowing and getting our liquid in the wrong place, right? Not a pleasant feeling. All right, so here's your little acronym to remember. For pharynx is NOL, N-O-L. Nasopharynx, which is almost parallel here to the nose. Oropharynx, which is a little below the oral cavity here. And then laryngopharynx here is going to be at the bottom. All right, and so you need to know those separate parts, and we'll actually look at those on a small removable model here in just a little bit. Actually, I think that's in the respiratory section. This is just a really nice color-coded picture that I found that shows you exactly where the differentiations of those are. Models have their limitations. They are helpful, but they can be limited. And so this picture is really helpful. You can see exactly where the nasopharynx is. And see here, it kind of goes behind the nose. Remember, NOL, nasopharynx, nose. Oropharynx is going to start here just below the oral cavity, and then laryngopharynx is going to be more down here. All right, so next we have the esophagus. This is about 25 centimeters long, and this extends from the pharynx all the way down to the stomach. It contains longitudinal and circular muscles to help move that bolus of food through actually peristalsis down onto the stomach. Now we'll be looking at the different sections of the stomach, and it will probably be more than you ever wanted to learn about your stomach and the different parts. Well, the stomach here is going to help accumulate and digest food. All right, so first we're going to look at the lower esophageal sphincter. Sphincters are areas of regulation and control, and when working properly, prevent things from going backward and traveling back up into different areas. So this is a bundle of muscles at the lower end of the esophagus where it meets the stomach. It can be hard to identify some of the differences on the models. So when it is closed, it actually prevents acid from traveling back up into the esophagus. And so if you have some issues here, then you can have that acid reflux and burn. That is such a problem for many people. Next, here we have the cardia of the stomach, and it is hard to see here. Be sure and pay attention to where on these models that I point specifically, and I try to be specific about how I ask the question. So this is the portion of the stomach that is closest to the esophagus. All right, the closest to the esophagus. Food and liquids pass through the cardia to enter the stomach from the esophagus. Next, we have the fundus, and this is not the only place that you will hear the word fundus. If you've ever been expecting or had a child and gone for regular health care, prenatal care, you know they measure, or you may have noticed that when they measure your belly, they measure to what they call the fundus of your uterus. A fundus is the part that goes above the opening. So you can see here, this raises up above the opening of the stomach. So that's what a fundus is. You could say it's a superior dilation of the stomach, and again, it's the portion that goes above the opening. Next, we have the body, and as with all things, the body is going to be the largest part of the organ. And so we can call this also gastric body or corpus. And you can see here, APR is pretty clear. This one, you're going to have to look and see that I'm talking about the whole thing. Next, we have the pylorus, which is also sometimes called the pyloric antrum or the pyloric region. This represents the outward flow section of the stomach. So the stomach passes its contents into the duodenum after it flows through the pylorus. One way to remember the parts of the body is cows find bulls passionate, and that stands for cardium fundus body pylorus, and that just tells you the main portions. All right, here we have another sphincter. This is the pyloric sphincter, which is near the pylorus, so that makes sense. And this controls the opening of the closing of the pyloric canal, and then, of course, therefore, passage to the duodenum. All right, next we have rugae, which are gastric folds, another name for gastric folds. And these kind of squeeze in, and then when your stomach is distended or overly full, the gastric folds will actually disappear. So it allows for having that extra space to be distended. So here we have the greater curvature. We have two curvatures. Greater means larger, so we'll have the greater curvature here. And this is an attachment site for the greater omentum. And as you have seen, we do reference these points, greater curvature, lesser curvature we referenced when we were talking about veins in the cardiovascular system. All right, next we have the lesser curvature, and here I've got the number circled, so don't let that confuse you. This is the smaller curvature. Attachment site for the lesser omentum. Now we're going to be looking at some of the structures lower in the abdominal and pelvic cavity, abdominopelvic cavity here. Here we have the duodenum or duodenum. This is the first of the three parts of the small intestines, and this receives partially digested food from the stomach and begins the process of absorption. Here we have hepatopancreatic ampulla here on the left, and then we have the major duodenal papillae on the right here. Hepatopancreatic ampulla, this is a duct formed by the union of the pancreatic duct and the common bile duct. It can also be called the ampulla vater, and it's located near the major duodenal papilla. Which is important because this is the that it marks the transition area from the foregut to the midgut. So this is a landmark, so to speak. The major duodenal papilla is a rounded projection at the opening of the common bile duct and the pancreatic duct. This is responsible for the secretion of bile and digestive enzymes, so that's why this one is really important. This is just another picture here of the major duodenal papillae on a different model. So we already looked at the first section of the small intestines, the duodenum. And so remember, there's three sections. The first one is the duodenum, then we have jejunum, and then we have ileum. You need to know those three sections. And so this is the jejunum, and this can be difficult to isolate in these models exactly where they're at. And so I try to be very specific here in what you are pointing at. And so we're looking right here, and on this model, it is right here. Okay, and so this is responsible for 40% of the small intestine. So 40% of the small intestines is actually jejunum. And so it plays an important role in digestion. It also absorbs water and nutrients. All right, and so the last portion is the ileum, and that's probably easier one to point out because you can see it very clearly marked there. This is separated from the large intestines by the ileocecal valve. So ileum, ileocecal for cecum. So that's the valve in between the ileum and the cecum. Here we have the cecum, and this is the first part of the large intestines. So here we have the ileocecal valve. It's not very easy to identify as a valve, but you can kind of see it there, and you can see it a little bit better here. And of course, that's the valve, as I already stated, between the ileum and the cecum, so a good name. It can also be called the colic valve, and there's actually several names for this. So let's stick with ileocecal valve. There's like 5 different names they call this. This separates the small and large intestines and limits reflux or backwards flow of the colonic contents, so contents from the colon into the ileum. So that's important. We don't want those large bowel contents to come backwards because that would make you very, very ill. All right, so the colon is part of the large intestines. It extends between the cecum and the rectum. It is about 1.5 meters in length and has 4 parts. We have the ascending colon here. Well, ascending is the part going up. Transverse is transverse, laying on its side. Descending colon, and then hard to see in these 2 pictures is the sigmoid colon, named so because it has somewhat of an S shape. So it has an S shape to it. And in some pictures that's easy to see, and some it doesn't really look like an S, but that is the sigmoid colon. All right, so we've got transverse colon here. Okay, and now we have the descending colon. And here in the model on the right, we're looking at this from the back, and you can kind of see that S shape here. It's harder to see that this has kind of an S shape over here in APR, but you can see the S shape really well on this particular model. The last part of the large intestine is, of course, the rectum, and this connects the sigmoid colon to the anal canal. And this is important for things like water resorption and electrolytes coming from the stool. And of course, this is where the stool will go to exit the body. So the stool is going to exit the body through the opening, and we, of course, call that the anus. And so here is the anus on this model. It's going to be right here. Now we're going to be looking at the liver and the pancreas. All right, so here we see the liver, and the liver has 4 lobes. This is in the upper right quadrant of the abdomen. It is an accessory organ to the gastrointestinal tract, and it has many, many, many functions. These include things like detoxification, protein synthesis, biochemical production, and nutrient storage. So this guy has a lot of jobs. The liver is divided into 4 lobes. The right lobe is the largest of the 4 lobes. And I want you to pay attention when you are looking at the liver and orient yourself. Look for landmarks. Where is this gallbladder here? Okay, and so that's going to help you keep the smaller lobes straight. And you want to be sure, are you looking at it from top to bottom? Is the gallbladder on the top? Can you see the gallbladder, or is it hidden here? Okay, so you are looking at the anterior portion of the liver here, posterior portion here. So be sure when you're looking at these things, and this is with anything, but sometimes it's more important for certain aspects, certain models or organs that we're looking at, and this is one of those, because when we look at the 2 smaller lobes, the quadrate and caudate lobe, you're going to need to know which way you're looking at the liver. So now the smaller portion is the left lobe. All right, in the way this is oriented, you can see the left lobe is here, the patient's left, and we're looking at it retroperitoneally here, and this is the left lobe here. Next we have the caudate lobe, So notice the location of the gallbladder. So we're looking at this posteriorly from the back, all right? And so this one is the caudate lobe. It's a little harder to see in this model. It's shown by those 2 little lines. Next here we have the quadrate lobe. It's a little bit bigger here, okay, and it is right next to the gallbladder in this model here. So you've got to really kind of pay attention to how these are laid out. The gallbladder is one that you should not miss. I fully expect you not to miss this because it's nice and green and pretty obvious, all right? The gallbladder facilitates the generation and absorption of micronutrients from macromolecules, and it also acts as a reservoir for bile. On the gallbladder, we have the hepatic duct, and this transports secretions from the liver into the intestines. And so again, here you have to pay attention to location, 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 right? And so we're looking right here. You can see this here is showing you that it's that one side on that model. So different models sometimes display this a little bit differently, but pay close attention to where exactly these are on these models so you don't get them confused. So here we have the cystic duct, and in this model you see it's going directly to the gallbladder, and it is a little more inferior on this model. It is a shorter duct that joins the gallbladder to the common hepatic duct. Bile can flow in both directions, so that it can be both released and stored. All right, and so while these weren't named internal and external, we did have two forks, and then where they come together, then we call that common. So this is our common bile duct where they come together. All right, so here we have the pancreas, which is this portion here. Here's the pancreas. This is an accessory organ for the digestive system. It also acts as an exocrine gland, and it can act somewhat as an endocrine gland when it produces hormones. And on the pancreas is what we call the pancreatic duct. You can see it's a raised portion here. Here you kind of have to use your imagination. This is what joins the pancreas to the common bile duct and helps to supply pancreatic juice, which aids in digestion. So it is important.